Hola, buenas, bienvenidos a La Vanguardia. Estamos en la 13ª edición de estas conversaciones que tenemos bajo el ciclo Sostenibilidad y Finanzas. Este ciclo lo inauguramos en el 2020 y nos ha permitido conocer de primera mano figuras muy relevantes de todo el mundo, de todo el planeta, en relación al activismo medioambiental, con quienes hemos profundizado sobre cuáles son los retos que tenemos que afrontar tanto en el presente como en el futuro para que nuestro planeta no fallezca, que nuestro planeta prospere y sobre todo que las nuevas generaciones lo tengan mejor que nosotros y no peor, que ese es uno de los retos. Hoy queremos dar voz al señor Eron Bloomgarden, que es fundador de Leaf Coalition, de Leaf Coalition, que es la iniciativa que alinea gobiernos y empresas a proteger los bosques para reducir las emisiones. El señor Bloomgarden es experto en finanzas ambientales, infraestructura verde y también en inversión de impacto. Ha asesorado a gobiernos y a corporaciones sobre muchos aspectos de las finanzas ambientales. Es un inversor de impacto experimentado con más de una década de experiencia en la gestión de fondos. Eron Bloomgarden es además profesor de finanzas sostenibles en el Instituto de la Tierra de la Universidad de Columbia. Fue socio de Eco Securities, la compañía de créditos de carbono más grande que hay en el mundo y que fue adquirida por JP Morgan. Y también fue miembro del Consejo de la Agenda Global sobre Biodiversidad en el Foro Económico Mundial. Con esta breve presentación, en que podíamos hablar mucho y largamente sobre el currículum del señor Bloomgarden, le queremos dar la bienvenida a esta conversación con La Vanguardia. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Bueno, pues usted dirá, porque tenemos muchos frentes. Durante estas 13 conferencias hemos hablado de mares, hemos hablado de contaminación plástica, hemos hablado de economía también sostenible. Hoy también podemos hablar del tema de los bosques, que es una de las cuestiones que usted lidera y que nos gustaría conocer con mayor profundidad.
Well, again, thank you so much for the invite. This is such an important topic, and thank you to La Vanguardia for hosting this. I think this is an absolutely urgent message and very very topical. Clearly, I, as you mentioned, am the CEO of a nonprofit organization called Emergent. We have launched an initiative called the Leaf Coalition, and I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that. The aim of the Leaf Coalition is to reverse global deforestation. But before we talk about deforestation, I think it's important for us to understand, to step back and to understand what's happening with climate change and why is this such a big issue. And I don't think we talk about this enough. And I just wanted to make one brief point here. What you're seeing on this slide is two graphs. The blue line is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And the red line is the temperature on this planet over the last 800,000 years. And I think what you can see very clearly is how correlated they are. I mean, they're almost mirror images. And so what scientists understand, is that the concentration of greenhouse gases, or CO2, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere is really the primary knob or lever that controls temperature. And the other thing I'll point out is the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years have stayed in a very relatively narrow band, as you can see here, from about 300 to 200, what are called parts per million, parts of CO2 per million in the atmosphere. And those peaks and valleys can be the difference between an ice age and a real warming trend. And you can see the temperatures following. So where are we now? And you can see, if you look to the right of the chart, you can see that line has just gone really off the charts. We are now, and just as of last week, one of the main measurements is on the observatory in Hawaii. We're now at 425 parts per million. We've never really, as far back as we can tell, gone over 300. So this is why this is so urgent. What we've seen so far is about 1.25 degrees Celsius of warming on this 425 parts per million. Science tells us that we cannot go above 1.5 degrees. If we go much beyond that, we start seeing really catastrophic impacts. And so clearly, we are in a climate crisis. We're not only in a climate crisis, though, we've got other urgent environmental issues, and we're also in a forest crisis. So deforestation is a serious problem. It contributes to climate change. It also contributes to the loss of species and biodiversity. And of course, there are communities and people that live in or near the forest and depend on these forests. We lose about 15 billion trees a year. That equals about 41 million per day. From a climate perspective, tropical deforestation contributes, depending on the year, between 10 and 15% to global greenhouse gas emissions. So to put that in perspective, if all of the deforestation in the world was a country, it would be the third largest emitter behind China and the United States. So there really is no viable pathway to keep on this 1.5 degree pathway that I mentioned without halting and reversing tropical deforestation by 2030. There's some good news here, though. And the good news is, at least when we talk about deforestation, we don't need to invent a new technology. A tree is very effective at capturing CO2 and storing it underground or in its trunks or in its branches or in its leaves. So we have the technology. The challenge here is one of finance, one of incentives, one of political decision making. So this is something that we can do, and we can get these 10 to 15% reductions in deforestation. So we have created what I mentioned earlier, which is called the LEAF Coalition. LEAF stands for Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. So the current situation, we're sitting here in 2023, and why do we see so much deforestation? Well, one reason is that we have misaligned economic incentives. In other words, forests are often worth more dead than alive. So if you are, in the Amazon and looking for economic opportunity, a standing forest doesn't give you much. It's only in some sort of extractive use that often gives you some economic benefit. So what we're trying to do with the LEAF Coalition is change those. So by using carbon markets or voluntary carbon markets to get companies and other organizations to purchase high integrity carbon credits that are generated by reducing deforestation and by massively creating flows of finance to change the economic incentives to make forests worth more alive than dead. And that could mean finance for creating new protected areas, enforcing existing laws against illegal deforestation, providing communities with alternative livelihoods so they don't have to deforest in order to make a proper living. We're providing the government with equipment. It could provide indigenous peoples with the resources they need to be the forest guardians that they want to be. Anyway, what we're trying to get to is by 2030, we want zero deforestation across the planet. So that's our goal. So how do we do this? First, we think it's critical. First, we need collaboration. We need a public-private partnership that brings together the governments of the forest countries, brings the multinational companies in the private sector, brings donor governments, brings investors, and brings other stakeholders. There's no one organization that can do this alone, but if we have a platform that can align action, collective action, this is a problem, this is a challenge that we can address. And this is what we're trying to do with LEAF. LEAF is all about ambition and scale. We need to reverse deforestation to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, to achieve the temperature agreements of the Paris agreements. Only way we're going to do that is massive scale. And so that's what we're trying to do. Meanwhile, protecting forests, huge climate benefits, but also massive co-benefits, supporting sustainable economic development, indigenous people and local communities, and biodiversity. You know, in Europe or the United States or most of the industrialized world, we don't have deforestation. And it's not that we never had deforestation. We had quite a bit of deforestation, but we've moved. Our economies have moved beyond that. And so what we want to do is help the tropical forest economies move to a green economic model where the pressure is off the forests, so we have sustainable gains in terms of reducing deforestation. And lastly, we need very high integrity carbon markets. Carbon markets have been in the press. Some people like them, some people don't. And what I would say to that is there is a right way and there's a wrong way to do carbon markets. And we need a high integrity right way to do it. One of those ways is making Emergent, who's the coordinator of the LEAF Coalition and acts as the intermediary, a nonprofit. Right? We're not taking a margin. We're not taking any profit on those carbon credits. This is really important. We need high integrity standards to make sure that emission reductions are real and they're additional. They go beyond what would have happened in a business as usual scenario. We need to make sure that the buyers, the companies that are buying these carbon credits, are using carbon credits for what's called residual emissions. In other words, these companies are doing everything within their own operations, within their own value chains to reduce emissions, and they're using carbon offsets to cover the part that's technologically impossible right now to address. And how do we get scale? So we are moving with LEAF from small projects to what's called jurisdictional scale. So an entire country or a large state, like let's say an Amazon state, becomes the accounting area. It becomes, you can say, the project. So most of what's happened over the last 20 years in carbon markets has been project level. So if you buy a carbon credit, you're often buying a credit from a project. And there's a role for projects, and there are very good projects that have done very good things on the ground and will continue to do very good things on the ground, and that deserve support. But to get to the scale, to really move the needle and to halt deforestation by 2030, we need a way to get to much larger scale. And moving to this country level or jurisdictional approach, we think is the way to do that. One way to think about this is the whole country, let's say, becomes the project. And everything that is happening within that country to reduce deforestation becomes the activities that generate carbon credits. So this is the so-called jurisdictional approach. And by doing that, by using this jurisdictional approach, it allows us to utilize lots of levers or lots of tools. We have government policy and legislation. We have private investment. We have law enforcement and monitoring. We can empower indigenous people and local communities. We can develop large-scale, ambitious management plans. So there's lots of things we can do once we move to the jurisdictional level and jurisdictional approach. So what we're doing is new in some ways. The main thing is we're activating the private sector. And so I'll tell you more about LEAF. We've got 26 large multinational companies involved in LEAF making commitments, over $1 billion of commitments so far. But we're standing on nearly 15 years of activity in what's been called in the international climate negotiation REDD+, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And the plus stands for Sustainable Forest Management and other things. This was launched in the International Climate Meeting back in 2007, which was held in Bali. And since then, there has been lots of rules, let's say technical rules that have come out, policy rules, and a lot of funding, actually. A lot of funding that's come from donor countries to forest nations to get what's called ready for this market. And so we're now activating what we hope will be a large-scale private sector market that can create these incentives and builds on this infrastructure that's been built over the last 15 years to mobilize this finance to change the incentives on the ground, again, to make forests worth more alive than dead. So how does LEAF work? Very simply, we start at the top with companies and sovereign donor governments. So right now we have the participation of 4 sovereign donors, the United States, UK, Norway, and the Republic of Korea. The corporates and the sovereigns commit finance. They commit to purchase credits, high integrity credits that are produced from the forest protection efforts of the countries that participate in LEAF. Step 2 is the jurisdictions or the countries implement the activities to reduce deforestation. Step 3 is those reductions need to be verified to a third-party standard. The standard we use is called the Architecture for Red Transactions. And so there's a third party. Just think about in the financial world, we have audit firms. So this is a process to ensure that the emission reductions are real and have been calculated the right way. The art standard issues the credits to the supplier, and then we would pay, the LEAF would pay the jurisdictions for those credits, right? So that's the flow of funds. And then step 5, those funds get reinvested by the host jurisdictions into climate positive activities and activities that will protect the forest even more. And the idea is this creates a virtuous cycle because then we have more corporates, more companies, more investment to keep this flywheel going. So our progress so far, as I mentioned, we've got 26 companies, and you can see them here. Some of the largest companies in the world. I would say these are climate leaders, and each of these companies have had to prove that they're using credits again to mitigate for supplemental emissions. So that they're doing everything they can within their own operations to reduce their own emissions, and they're using these credits for supplemental emissions. The way we work with LEAF is we invite forest countries to send us a proposal, and then we do an eligibility assessment, and then we choose, based on that eligibility assessment, we say to the LEAF buyers, these are available for transactions. And you can see here the countries and states that have had accepted proposals. We continue to invite proposals, and our aim here is to really mobilize a lot of finance. We have now well over $1 billion of funds committed. We're working towards the transactions, signing final agreements with the first 3 countries who will be suppliers of credits. But where do we want to go? We want to scale this massively. We want to go from 1 billion over a 5-year period, which is what we are now. We think really to solve this problem, we need 10 billion a year. So the companies pay roughly $10 per ton. So that's so that's 1 billion tons per year. With that, we think we can really move the needle on and achieve zero deforestation by 2030. I'll pause there, but thank you very much. Really appreciate being here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Realmente es un proyecto muy ambicioso y muy interesante que necesita de la implicación de los países, pero también de las empresas. Voy a empezar por ahí. Ustedes, cuando van a ver a las empresas, ¿cómo las convencen? Y si les cuesta mucho convencerlas para que entren en este sistema.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So maybe I can start with and maybe this is part of the question, which is why are companies doing this in the first place? Why are they taking these targets? And so, because these are voluntary targets by most of these companies. And so there's a lot of pressure on companies now to take real and meaningful action on climate change. And, you know, if we were having this conversation a few years ago, the main motivation for most of these companies would have been PR and marketing, and maybe corporate philanthropy. But we're seeing that this activity, meaning having real climate ambition, has moved from, let's say, the chief marketing officer to the CFO and the CEO. And there's quite a lot of pressure coming on companies from financial regulators, financial disclosure, from their customers, from the places they operate and do business, from their own employees. And so there's also a framework now for companies to make long-term climate targets. These usually are nested within what's called net zero, long-term net zero goals or climate neutrality goals. So, so that's why they're doing that. And so is it challenging to convince these companies? Some yes, some no. I would say one of the challenging things is that this idea of a jurisdictional approach is new for most companies. Companies who have been involved in carbon markets are familiar normally with projects. They're not familiar with the jurisdictional approach. Because ultimately, the counterparty, instead of a private sector project developer, is going to be, let's say, the country of Costa Rica, the state of Pará in Brazil. I mean, a government. So, so that is, I think, the challenge. But I think the companies that we have, many of the companies that we have in LEAF are also active in projects, and they're experimenting with LEAF. They're saying, okay, will you make at least part of our commitment through LEAF to this jurisdictional approach? But I think once we can prove that this works, and we still haven't had any actual credits issued through LEAF yet, and it takes time to build these programs for the donor countries to come online. But once we prove that this works, and when I say this works, that credits are delivered, they're high integrity and real emission reductions, that there's been real impact on the ground, I think we'll see a lot. It will become much easier to get companies to see the light.
Y ellas, estas empresas que participan en estos proyectos, más allá de la cuestión moral o de la cuestión de imagen, ¿tienen en su mesa el retorno que les supone este tipo de acciones, tanto en cuanto a sus clientes, en cuanto a su negocio, como en cómo su aportación tiene un efecto en el territorio en donde en donde estáis trabajando? Es decir, ellos tienen un resultado en la mesa.
The companies who are participating in LEAF are not looking for a return. This is not a profit-generating activity. In fact, one of the rules that we have in LEAF is any profit that would be made on reselling the credits would have to go back to the host jurisdiction. So this is about companies meeting their climate targets that they've got typically board commitments to meet. So this is part of their strategy to meet those targets. In terms of the impacts on the ground, one of the reasons that I think companies like this is that there will be real verified impacts on the ground as measured by tons of carbon dioxide equivalent sequester. And then there will be we'll be also quantifying other impacts in terms of community benefits, biodiversity benefits, etc. And these will all be verified and delivered to the buyers.
Hemos hablado del sector privado, pero aquí también tiene mucho que ver el sector público y sobre todo los gobiernos de estas zonas, de estas jurisdicciones donde van a recibir esa mejora en su medio ambiente. Pero a veces eso choca con los propios intereses económicos de esos mismos países, porque se produce la desforestación porque de ahí se saca también un rendimiento comercial, industrial. ¿Cómo se rompe esa dinámica tan perversa? Como cuando ustedes van a hablar con un gobierno o con un Estado y les dicen, les explican su proyecto, que desistan de su industria que pasa por la desforestación y que se vayan a este otro escenario que es mucho más sostenible. ¿Cómo, si se apuntan a esto enseguida o ven un perjuicio?
This is an excellent question. So we don't necessarily always have to convince tropical forest countries that the benefit they will get from participating in LEAF and getting carbon payments will outweigh some other opportunity costs that they get from complete extractive use of the forest. There are good people, of course, in these governments who want to do the right thing for their people and for the environment. I mean, they know these developing countries are going to be hardest hit by climate change. So they want to play their role, and typically there's other very important local benefits from protecting their forests that go beyond climate change. And so it doesn't always have to be one for one, right? You get $10 for your carbon benefits, and so it has to be higher than some other use of the forest. It doesn't have to be that way. But what we do hear from them is we need some economic value in order to keep this forest standing. Right? If there's zero economic value, it's very hard. We've got disadvantaged populations and people who need to eat, right? So we need some economic value. So that's important. Now, the other part of this that I would point out is the participation of the public sector in the industrialized world. And I mentioned we have US, UK, Norway, and South Korea. And their role is I would say twofold. One is they are providing collectively $500 million of purchase guarantees. So they act as a buyer of last resort. The idea here of LEAF is really to create this private sector market, but we're trying to create the volumes, the supply. And so the US, UK, Norway, South Korea are acting as buyers of last resort, but they are also acting and engaging with with the tropical forest governments, providing capacity development funding, technical assistance funding. And so the idea is to create a package that includes financial incentives, results-based payments, but also upfront capacity development, technical assistance, and I would say bilateral relationships as well with the donor governments and the tropical forest countries, and also the private sector. Many of these companies have operations on the ground, and if they say, look, we're really interested in making sure that the forests are conserved here. And so what we try to bring to the forest countries is sort of as full of a package as we can that says, yes, the payment is part of it, but there are all other incentives that we want to package it into this.
Me he fijado antes en el mapa que usted ha mostrado que las jurisdicciones donde están trabajando se concentran sobre todo en África Central, en la parte tropical, obviamente, y también en Sudamérica hay 2 puntos en Asia. Le voy a hacer una pregunta un poco delicada, pero que tiene que ver con la geopolítica, ¿no? En estas zonas, justamente, hay unos gobiernos, los gobiernos de esos países, algunos de ellos que con algunas dudas sobre sus sistemas democráticos, sobre sus sistemas de gobierno, algunos incluso que tienen problemas bélicos, que están en guerras o que tienen problemas internos. Todo eso me imagino que para ustedes, cuando llaman a la puerta de un país donde tienen esos enormes problemas políticos y también sociales, llegar ustedes con este discurso, no sé si les cierran la puerta, enseguida les dicen que se vayan. ¿Eso cómo lo administran? Porque claro, es justamente en esa zona tropical donde hay estos países que están en una revolución constante, si me permite la expresión.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I mentioned when we receive proposals, we do a comprehensive eligibility assessment. And part of that is the stability of the government and the likelihood that they are going to actually reduce deforestation if we work with them. And a government that is in the midst of political turmoil or conflict, or may not score very high on that eligibility assessment, and may not get a lot of interest from buyers. So that's the first point I would say. The second is we are, governments are, it can be a challenge working with governments, but if we're going to scale climate action, we've got to work with what we have. And the governments are what we have, right? They have the power to create new protected areas, to enforce laws, to incentivize the private sector. And so what we're trying to do is create incentives to get them to do those things, to protect their own forests and to preserve biodiversity and solve climate change. So, but it's an important question and one that we work very, very closely with the governments. And I should say, we are a small nonprofit and emergent, but we work also directly with our government donor partners. So we engage with these governments also with and through the embassies of U.S., UK, Norway, and others.
Justamente de eso también le quería preguntar, porque ha mencionado Estados Unidos, Reino Unido, Noruega y Corea. Nosotros en España estamos en la Unión Europea y la Unión Europea se habla mucho y está aparentemente y políticamente muy comprometida con la sostenibilidad y con la lucha contra el cambio climático, impulsando toda una serie de leyes y de actitudes, ¿no? Para luchar justamente contra esto. No veo aquí ningún país de la Unión Europea. ¿Eso es porque todavía no han llamado a la puerta? ¿O porque, qué sucede con la Unión Europea?
Well, we would love more participation of some EU countries. We've talked to many of them. There's a lot of interest. In fact, Germany, for example, has a relationship with the Norway in the UK on forests. And so we would hope, LEAF is open, and so we would hope to have more European, or let's say a European country involved. Of course, we have the UK and Norway, but we would be thrilled. We'd be absolutely delighted if Spain were interested in participating with LEAF.
Bueno, el Reino Unido se fue de la Unión Europea, que es esto también. En relación a este primer mundo respecto al sur global, además de esta aportación que dan, que dan como patrones, como dinero, también se traduce en influencia, porque hablando del Reino Unido está la Commonwealth y tienen influencia en muchísimos países, las antiguas llamadas colonias de los países ricos, ¿no? O la influencia geopolítica y económica que puede tener, hablando de Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, ¿no? ¿Utilizan estos patrones, estos países patrones, su influencia política en estos otros países donde se encuentra esta desforestación para empujarles, para ayudarles, para convencerles de que tienen que acoger este sistema de regeneración?
Absolutely, and that's what I was mentioning earlier. We work with the embassies, we work with the teams in Washington, London, and Oslo, in very close collaboration. I mean, one example is most recently with the U.S., President Biden had a major economies forum on Earth Day that was focused on climate and nature, and there was a lot of engagement with Brazil. And with the new administration, sort of the first time that Brazil really came out publicly and mentioned using carbon markets and also mentioned LEAF. So there's a lot of I also mentioned the UK was one of the leaders of a new initiative called the Forest and Climate Leadership Partnership, which tries to bring in dialogue many countries together around this issue. And LEAF, our initiative, is often featured prominently in those at the UN meetings called COP, the Conference of Parties. We work very closely with our donor government partners. So there's a lot of engagement. There's absolutely of course there is a lot of engagement, and quite frankly, that's not only important for the forest jurisdictions, for the host countries, for the developing world countries, which it, of course is, but it's also important for the companies because let's face it, in the carbon market, there's been a lot of controversy. There was a few months ago an article in the Guardian, UK, criticizing the use of carbon offsets, and so companies. My view is the highest and best use of companies' climate funding for offsetting is to protect nature. And I think this resonates with companies. They want to do it, but they want to make sure they're doing the right thing. And I think there's no doubt that the participation of the donor governments has helped give confidence to those companies to get involved in this initiative. In fact, the government of South Korea was very explicit when they joined us in LEAF. They said, we want to give a signal to the private sector that this is something they should be considering doing. This is the right way forward. So yes, to answer your question simply, we're very actively involved in collaborating with the donor governments.
A ojos del usuario, de las personas que nos están viendo y que están siguiendo esta conversación, sobre todo desde el primer mundo, ahora estamos hablando desde Barcelona, desde España y desde la Unión Europea, estamos recibiendo mensajes, por ejemplo, en ámbitos de la arquitectura, de las casas, de los edificios, mensajes en el sentido de que hay que volver a la madera, que hay que volver a los materiales más naturales. Y eso, claro, eso necesita, la madera necesita árboles y por lo tanto necesita cortar esos árboles. ¿No es un poco contradictorio por dónde va la industria, por dónde nos dicen a los consumidores que va la industria sostenible con, luego, cuidado, que no desforestemos el planeta?
This is an excellent question. So not all logging, not all timber is equal from a sustainability perspective. Most of the timber in the United States and Europe is produced sustainably, right? There are laws that require timber production to be managed properly, meaning you can't clear cut an entire forest. You've got to replant. You've got to harvest trees within a certain time period. So that's not, you don't have deforestation. In fact, there are ways to manage a forest that improves their carbon sequestration capability. Right? You can cut trees. You can leave trees in the ground longer. Let's say from a 5-year rotation to a 10-year rotation. So there's also, you can plant different, more natural diversity of trees. So there are good ways to manage working forests. And in fact, by creating good working forests, sustainably managed working forests, that takes pressure off of illegal deforestation, illegal harvesting, illegal timber, which is what we want. And I think one reason that we're hearing more about using, sustainable wood for building materials is this concept of long life wood. Because what we want is, we want that carbon that's been sequestered, right, from the trees. We don't want that to be burned and go up in smoke. We want that to be sequestered in something that sticks around for the next 50 to 100 years. So furniture or buildings or things like that. So the more of that we can lock up into productive use through a sustainable working forest, the better off we are.
Justamente en España, pero también hay algún país europeo que se encuentra en la misma situación, estamos con el debate de que los bosques y el ámbito rural, para entendernos, se está abandonando, que ya no hay muchos agricultores y sobre todo no sale a cuenta tener bosques porque cuesta mucho su mantenimiento y acaban muchas veces, desgraciadamente, víctimas de las llamas, víctimas de los incendios, que sobre todo en la cuenca mediterránea en verano son muy habituales. Por lo que me está explicando, señor Bloomgarden, puede haber una economía sostenible vinculada a los bosques sin que eso signifique su abandono y que además pueda revertir también en la economía.
Absolutely. Of course, you'd want to put forests in the right place. So we need the right climatic conditions, enough rainfall, enough humidity for the specific species that you would use. And this becomes even more challenging with climate change because, of course, temperatures are changing, rainfall is changing. But I think there is absolutely a smart and sustainable way to plant and manage a productive working forest. And there's lots of examples of that, around the world, including, in the United States, where I'm familiar. A lot of sustainable forests in California, which has one of the most progressive forest management laws, but also in the Northeast of the United States. They're beautiful, very well maintained working forests. And in fact, a lot of them are looking to create carbon credits themselves by improving the way that they manage those forests. So there's a lot of good that can come from working forests. What we're talking about with LEAF is protecting forests. So there is a role for both working forests that produce timber and other commodities and are managed in a sustainable way and a resilient way. But there is also a role for preserving and protecting intact ecosystems. And so without touching them, without extractive use. So we need both.
Uh-huh. Al principio de su exposición nos ha mostrado un gráfico de lo mal que vamos en el sentido de las emisiones y sin ninguna ansia, sin ningún interés de que seamos muy catastrofistas, pero explíquenos qué sucede cuando no cuidamos nuestros bosques y qué sucede si no frenamos esta desforestación a nivel práctico, a nivel de nuestro día a día, a corto o medio plazo. ¿Qué nos puede suceder?
Well, forests specifically have not only, as I mentioned earlier, not only climate impacts, but also many other impacts in terms of biodiversity and human health. From a climate perspective, there is no way we can achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, the UN's temperature goals, without reversing and stopping deforestation. So if we don't protect our forest, we are going to blow through the 1.5 degree target, which we may anyway. But it's not. It's important also to recognize the targets that are in the Paris Agreement. It's not a static question as to whether we meet it or not, and if we don't, oh well. No, the climate keeps changing, and we go from 1.5 to 2 degrees to 2.5, 3, 4, and the impacts keep getting worse. So we need to take action as quickly as we can, and so forests need to play a role in this. One thing that I think people don't internalize about forests, because at least when I was a kid, you learn that a tree sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere and breathes out oxygen, and that's how we all breathe, and that's all true. So people think about a tree as sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the act of deforestation is also a massive source of emissions, because typically the way people are deforesting is they're burning down the forest, or it's the easiest way to do it, and you have this carbon that's stuck in the trees and the leaves and the branches and the roots and the soil, and you have this massive release of emissions. And so, mental images, as I'm ISO96, you've got these coal-fired power plants sitting in the Amazon or the forests of the world, spewing up climate pollution. If you think about it that way, it's not about just planting trees, which we need to do. It's about stopping the destruction of forests. In order to, right, we can't just talk about going to electric vehicles or installing, wind farms. We need to stop the emissions from deforestation. Otherwise, we're blowing through our climate targets. So that's climate. But if you look at biodiversity, we're also in a massive extinction crisis. And at least 50% of the world's biodiversity is living in these tropical rainforests. We don't even know what we're losing because so many of these species haven't even been found or identified yet. So, and biodiversity is essential for the resilience of our ecosystems. That's second. And third is forests, especially the Amazon, controls the water cycle. And so there is a massive airborne river that's over the Amazon that influences the rainfall around the world. And the concern is that when we reach a point in the Amazon, that there could be a tipping point. that you could see a fairly rapid collapse of the whole ecosystem. So I think it's right. Now I want to say another thing, and the reason I'm talking about the Amazon is when it comes to deforestation, we need to reverse deforestation around the world. And there's a lot of battles that we need to win across the tropics. But the war on deforestation, just because of the size, is going to be won in the Amazon, let's say Brazil, in Indonesia, and in the Congo Basin in Africa. We need to reverse deforestation massively in those places if we're going to win this war on deforestation.
¿Es la zona cero, la mayor zona de peligro, o habéis detectado después del Amazonas algún otro punto del planeta en Asia o en África que vaya detrás de esta deforestación, de este problema?
Again, I think Amazon is the let's say ground zero, if you will. But Indonesia is very important, and again, the Congo Basin, Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, also very important. These three regions are crucial. Now, there's a lot of hope in Brazil now with the new administration. We've seen last month 68% reduction in deforestation in that 1 month. So huge progress, and there's a lot of hope now with this new administration in Brazil. And so we need, as an international community, really to show as much support as we can for that new administration, to give them the incentives and the tools they need to reverse deforestation and to do it in a sustainable way. And part of that is to create these economic incentives, alternative livelihoods, and things like that. But those are the three key places.
Antes en su exposición ha hablado de que los pueblos indígenas, los que viven justamente dentro de esas masas forestales, especialmente en el Amazonas, puedan colaborar de alguna manera siendo vigilantes de esta deforestación, incluso puedan ser colaboradores necesarios para la forestación posterior, es decir, para recuperar esos espacios. ¿De qué forma están trabajando con estos pueblos indígenas?
Yeah. So that's also a great question. Indigenous peoples and local communities are the front line of defense for the world's forests. They are naturally the guardians of the forest. So they need the support through so-called benefit sharing. So when we make a payment to a government, we want to see that a significant part of that is going to those communities. But more than that, they really should need to be part of the design from the beginning with the governments, with the local and the national governments, of what a resilient, sustainable forest protection program looks like. So what we are doing, so we have a team that's focused on outreach to these indigenous communities, but we also work with partners around other NGOs, other nonprofits who have more experience in some of these regions than we do. And then the other thing is we talk to the participants, the members of the LEAF Coalition, the corporates, the donor governments, to say, this is really important and you need to be prioritizing buying credits, supporting the countries and the jurisdictions that are doing the right thing in terms of engaging with their indigenous peoples and providing them with the support and financial benefits associated with selling their carbon. Now, I should say that the global community came together in one of the climate conferences back in Cancun. It's actually called the Cancun Safeguards. And these are safeguards to say indigenous people, they need to be protected. There can't be infringement on their rights. You can't, you can't take their carbon rights, can't take their land. That's the minimum. That's the bare minimum. That's the basics. What we want to see is that they're actually integral part of the program design and the benefits.
¿Y estas comunidades son receptivas a vuestro proyecto?
Yeah, they're very keen. They're very keen. But of course, some of them have good and some of them have not so good relationships with their governments. There is, hundreds of years in some regions of conflict with their governments, and so that becomes a challenge. We need to bridge that. We need to create trust. There needs to be trust created between the governments and the indigenous peoples. Of course, we work with governments, and so our role here is to tell the governments we want to see these indigenous people rights respected, and we want to see them being part of the program design. The indigenous peoples are very interested to hear about the program. They naturally want to hear how are the benefits going to come down to us.
Ya vamos acabando. Tengo una última pregunta que hacerle justamente. Me imagino que me dirá que sí, pero espero que me diga que sí. Con toda esta operación que ustedes llevan a cabo, más otras muchas que hemos estado viendo en estas sesiones, pero en relación a esto concreto, a frenar la desforestación e incluso ir más allá y forestar, es decir, a aumentar la masa forestal, ¿estamos a tiempo? O sea, todavía estamos a tiempo de enmendar la situación negativa en la que estamos.
I'm a very optimistic person, and for me, the only pathway here is working on solutions. But it's from my perspective, it's impossible to say we have time or we don't have time. There is no other choice. We have no other choice than to move as quickly as we can to reverse deforestation and to reverse climate change, right? Of course, deforestation is part of that. We have no choice because it's not a question of time, it's a question of scale. The longer we go without massively bending the curve of greenhouse gas emissions, the more severe and consequential the challenges we face will be. Of course, there's time, but we also have climate change built in because greenhouse gas emissions, many of them have a long life in the atmosphere and will be with us for the next 100 years. So I think we need to do many things. Of course, I often get, what can I do personally? I think everybody brings skill to their job, to their profession. And the more you learn about climate change, the more you can apply what you're learning about climate change into what you're working on and what you do. I think everybody who's working on solutions needs to think about scale and speed. And you think, how do we get more? And, I often think we need 10x, 10 times the impact that as I said, we have $1 billion now. I think we need 10 billion. We need to really drive scale as quickly as possible. And fundamentally, we need to change incentives. We need to make doing the right thing more valuable than doing the wrong thing. So yes, we have time to avoid the worst consequences. And the longer we wait to act, the more expensive and painful it is going to be, not only to reverse climate change, but to deal with the impacts of climate change.
Muy bien, pues llegamos al final de nuestra conversación. Eron Bloomgarden, muchísimas gracias por este rato y por sus explicaciones, que yo creo que han ayudado mucho a nuestros espectadores de La Vanguardia para hacerse una idea del proyecto y del reto que tienen por delante, que es enorme, pero que nos ayudará, como decía al principio, a conseguir que nuestras futuras generaciones encuentren un planeta mejor del que nosotros hoy día tenemos. Muchas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Thank you so much. Enjoy being here.